Hello. Um, so I really think I should say something about these global climate protests that have been happening all over the world. I mean, they really are global. I think there's quite a few talking points to make with this one, so bear with me. Um, the protests have been taking place in the United States, in Canada, across the UK, in Germany, in Kenya, in Brazil, even as far away as Vanuatu, Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, Japan, Hong Kong, pretty much almost every continent, well, every continent, and it seems almost every country on earth. So this is truly a big series of protests. As I understand, they're ongoing throughout the week. Um, so it's a truly global scale event. It can't be ignored. Um, And in a year where we've seen so much devastation in the Amazon and also major fires in Central Africa, which got far less attention, but they were actually even larger in scale than those which were raging in the Amazon, or at least there was more of them, more individual fires recorded. Um, and in a year in which we saw the most powerful and deadly cyclone to hit the southern hemisphere for a long time in Cyclone Idai, which hit and devastated Mozambique and surrounding countries, then it's obvious. It's easy to see why this is a vocal point right now. I think it's fair to say these climate protests are maybe the defining feature of 2019. I'd say possibly even surpassing the US China trade war and the Iran Saudi Arabia tensions. If we were to have one thing that defines the year, it might be these sort of this climate activism. Now, just for the record, I'm not someone who's a climate change skeptic. What I mean by that is I'm not someone that believes it's all some big plot by left wing conspirators to try and destroy business. I'm not someone who believes that it's all exaggerated. I do think there are very real problems. And we've already seen evidence of that in low lying countries like the Maldives and in Pacific nations. Which actually explains the protests in Vanuatu. In Australia, the protests, I believe, in Sydney was the biggest since the Iraq War or anti-Iraq War protests in 2003. Um, and this involved mostly young people, their parents in many cases, and others. In Kenya, in the Nairobi protests, a woman had a witty sign which said, "I don't want the climate to be hotter than my imaginary boyfriend." There were a lot of creative placards, like I say, protests in big cities around the world, um, London, Dhaka, Hong Kong, Tokyo, New York City, Toronto. Um, so it's a global protest. And I do believe that climate change is a pressing issue, or rather the effects of climate change on people and on the basic infrastructure of the world. I do think that is a real issue, and I don't think it should be dismissed. Having said all that, there are some aspects about these protests that are noteworthy. Firstly, is the spiritual leader of this movement. I mean, this is a worldwide movement, right? And yet, its spiritual leader is a 16-year-old girl from Sweden. Now, I am quite skeptical of Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg, excuse me. Not so much for her concerns, not so much for her activism, but how I feel that she's being used by the likes of Extinction Rebellion. Um, in her latest interview with CNN, she said, "You adults need to start giving a damn, or rather, you adults don't give a damn about my future, right?" And this is kind of in keeping with her narrative. She's very populist. She's very much all about trying to expose world leaders and put them on the spot. Of course, only Western leaders. She's not going to go to China and do this, understandably. Um, but I do have to say, I don't think that that is something that is particularly brave or inspiring. Why? Because no Western politician is going to answer back to a a 16-year-old girl with Asperger's, especially a 16-year-old girl that looks like she's about 10. Um, and I think something very manipulative is going on. I've mentioned this before in a video specifically about her, but she's relevant because she's become a figurehead of the movement. And that is that if any politician that does sort of defend the record or even challenge her is immediately going to be denounced as, oh, how dare they? They're trying to make this brave young woman feel bad. And what I find troubling about Greta Thunberg is they've put her in this bubble, right, where she can just insult leaders with impunity. She can make these sweeping statements, nothing is being done, which is factually not true. Okay, if you actually look at individual government policies, there is a lot being done, arguably not enough. Right, I totally accept that. And when you look at countries like the United States under Trump, which is actually trying to reverse some climate policies, I mean, Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. There are certain governments that are not only not doing enough, but actively being hostile to action being taken. But a country like the UK, for example, we can do more, but the claim that successive British governments have done nothing is just factually not true. And if you actually get into the nitty gritty of this, if you look at the sort of demands that Extinction Rebellion are making, they want zero emissions in 5 years. That is just not plausible. You don't need to be an economist to see that. You don't need to be a climate expert to see that. It's just not plausible under any model without serious repercussions. Um, so I think that she needs a lot more scrutiny as the figurehead of this movement. I mean, I think what's going to happen is she's going to kind of she's already in a bubble, right? So she's not always going to be a 16-year-old girl. One day she's going to be an adult woman, and she's growing up with this kind of God complex. I can lecture world leaders. I know best. She's a 16-year-old girl. I think she's probably quite smart. I do believe that, but Greta Thunberg doesn't know more than everyone else on the planet. Okay, what she's doing is she's riding an important movement. She's become the figurehead of it, and I really, I mean, I was vocally attacked earlier today for pointing this out, and this woman laid into me because how dare you attack Greta? It's becoming something like a personality cult because her supporters put her in this bubble that she cannot be criticized, and I find it frankly quite disturbing. But like I say, she's not always going to be a 16-year-old girl. One day, 10, 20 years from now, she's going to be an adult woman, and she's going to realize that just insulting people um, won't get her what she wants. I mean, you could argue Donald Trump set a negative precedent, but Greta Thunberg comes out with these things like, "Oh, you don't care about our future. You adults don't give a damn. We know better than you adults." I find it very arrogant, frankly, quite obnoxious. But she gets away with it because, hey, she's a 16-year-old girl with Asperger's. So I have a problem with that. But even leaving her aside, there's Extinction Rebellion itself. I've been very vocally critical of that organization and their tactics. Polarizing the public with stupid things like trying to shut down airports is not going to help. Even the Hong Kong protests, which I strongly support, I thought it was a mistake for them to shut down the airport. But at least the Hong Kong protesters apologized. Extinction Rebellion don't really give a damn about who they disrupt or how much inconvenience they cause. And there's a mentality behind this. It's this mentality of might is right. So whoever shouts the loudest is right. You know what's interesting about this? It's not even about climate deniers versus those who believe that climate change is a real issue, as I do. It's now becoming climate purists. That is to say, people like Greta Thunberg and other leaders of Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam's another example, um, and others who just say, this is the problem, and you have to agree with our solution to dealing with it. And if you don't, then you're committing blasphemy. You must be a climate denier. You're an ignoramus. You're a terrible person. I'm not in denial about what's happening. You know, with the impact of this on low-lying nations. I mean, I could definitely understand someone living in Tuvalu or the Maldives, really. really feeling this with desperation. It is a desperate situation. And it goes without saying that whilst there has been climatic change for millennia, with the ever increasing global population, I think that's a major, major factor. I'm no expert, but it just doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that with more people on the planet using up more resources, that's going to lead to issues. I mean, some African countries now, Uganda is projected to quadruple in population, I believe, by 2050. Um, and it isn't China, it's actually African countries that are really, China might even balance out, it might even slightly decrease. But African countries are skyrocketing in population. As an example, Lagos in Nigeria, in 1960, around the time of Nigerian independence, it had a population of about 300,000. Today, it's about 15 million. So we're seeing this burgeoning, burgeoning populations. That's something that cannot be ignored in this issue because people are using up resources. And if that gets into uncomfortable territory about cultural sizes of family and so on, those are things that will need to be discussed if this problem is truly to be addressed. Um, because population density is a critical issue in this. I mean, look at countries like Bangladesh, which suffer badly from cyclones. And Bangladesh is a densely populated country, 150 million people, probably more than that now, in a country that's smaller than the UK, or at least about the same size as the UK. So I really think you can't ignore the population factor. Um, I think sustainable energy, green jobs, all those things are very, very important and definitely putting pressure on countries like the United States and China to do more. But frankly, it's not often I'll say this, but frankly, the US has less excuses. China is still a developing country, so it needs to match its environmental responsibilities with, a developing economy and getting more people into the middle class. The United States is already a very developed country, although that's not evenly dispersed. But the point is, it's a developed country. And for Donald Trump to pull out of the Paris Climate Summit is a disgrace that will, in my view, judge his presidency badly. So, allies of the United States need to put pressure on Trump, frankly, to to live up to climate commitments. Because if the United States doesn't sign up to climate agreements, then countries like China will argue, "Oh, why should we?" Um, so I think there's a lot that can be done. Green jobs, sustainable energy, and yes, population is a factor, particularly in developing countries. Um, So I'm not criticizing the protests. I think they have merit because there is a pressing problem. But I do have a problem with the oversimplicity of protest leaders, Greta Thunberg and others, who just come out with these statements like nothing is being done. That is alarmist and it is not factually true. It's just not true. So by those sort of alarmist narratives, um, it's not going to help. It's not going to help solve the problem. Um, what's happening in Brazil is, Bolsonaro's a disgrace. I think it is true that the Amazon is Brazilian territory, but the point is it's a unique ecosystem. So it's not good enough for Bolsonaro to say, oh, it's Brazil, so mind your own business. The Amazon is a unique lungs to the world. In fact, it's Brazil and Indonesia that between them, those two countries account for, I think it's something like 60% of all the world species. It's something like that. So, this is not something that can be taken lightly. Incidentally, although the Amazon is mostly Brazil, it also goes into Peru, Bolivia, Colombia. Um, so it's not just Brazil it covers. Anyway, I would like to see a situation where Greta Thunberg, when she's doing these interviews, journalists actually start asking her some difficult questions. I mean, her background needs to be a little bit scrutinized. She was seen with the far left group Antifa. Now, that's not her number one thing, but people are just holding her up to be the Messiah, and I have a problem with that. Is she remarkable? Yeah, she is. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I would not be surprised if Time name her the Person of the Year.